What are some psychology experiments with interesting results? Solomon Asch's experiment on conformity. He set up a test wherein he would show 3 lines of different lengths to 5 or 6 individuals, I forgot the exact number, who had to state which line was the longest of the 3. The thing is, only the last individual is the participant and the others are actors paid to answer in a specific manner. For the first few questions, they choose the correct answer, but later on they start choosing the wrong one. The participants are conflicted as to whether they will say the correct answer or conform to the wrong answer as to not be judged by others or due to self-doubt of their own answers. In the end, most do conform. It's really interesting since it shows how powerful conformity is in the face of doubt, up to a point that some even question their own sanity during the test. Another variation of the experiment also had interesting results. It had the same setup with 5 individuals with the last person being the participant. However, this time some of the actors say the wrong answer while one actor says the correct one. There was an increase in participants who would choose the correct answer and avoid conformity. It shows how much doubt one can have on oneself when alone, but be brought back to self-confidence when they find outside support. Edit. Conformity in participants might be caused by either being afraid others' judgment or due to self-doubt. One time I participated in a paid research experiment. I was basically tricked into thinking I was drunk. I was placed in a room with 2 other people and we were instructed to drink vodka with cranberry juice over a period of time while we socialized. After we drank, I was placed in a room where I had to read some flashing words on a computer. I felt pretty drunk at this point. When the researcher came back into the room, he gave me my car keys and said I was never actually given alcohol. He briefly told me that because I was anticipating drinking for this experiment that my brain had tricked me into feeling the effects of being intoxicated. I immediately snapped out of it and was completely amazed at how I felt. Hedonic Adaptation. Put simply, a person who had just won the lottery and another person who had just been paralyzed took a survey to measure their life contentment. Obviously it was high and low, respectively. However, they both took the same survey a year later and both scored similarly. The point being that regardless what happens to you in life, good or bad, you will always adapt and spend most of your life feeling neutral. Split brain studies. One example, by providing differing information to each hemisphere of the brain in split brain individuals, those with a severed corpus callosum, meaning there's no communication between the 2 hemispheres, they found that people would actually physically grab their own hand with their other hand if they saw it making a mistake. Basically each side of the brain controls one side of your body, and in split brain people you can actually make both sides display a disagreement with the other, which is insane, if you think about it. Mice were put on 2 sides of a wall with a door in. Only the right mouse could open the door. Slowly, they filled the left mouse's room with water and eventually when right mouse saw them in danger, they opened the door. However, mice that had previously been on the left side and were now on the right, mice who had previously been wetted, opened the door considerably faster because they knew how unpleasant it was to be in the other scenario. Basically mice have empathy. Link here. If you train a rat to press a lever for sugar, and then put it in a box with only that lever, it will press that lever as much as you'll allow it. The rat will stop eating and drinking and just do sugar. If you train a rat to press a lever for sugar and then put it in an enriched environment, egg, other rats to play with, toys, place to explore, where it could still press the lever for sugar, it may press the lever occasionally but not as frequently as its counterpart in the dull environment. These findings were a big deal in the behaviorism world because they put a lot of previous results into context and help explain the link between poverty and drug use. Edit. Wow. I didn't expect this to blow up like this. I'm on mobile and don't have access to a computer right now, so linking sources will be difficult. But a Google search of rat park will pull up plenty of sources. I was wrong about the rats being conditioned using sugar. It was morphine, but the idea is still the same. Many people have pointed out errors with these experiments, and there are plenty, but that's the beauty of science. It allows for the development of testable hypotheses which can change given the current state of evidence. Also, thank you for the silver kind stranger. Edit 2. This experiment does not prove that bad environments facilitate drug use or that good environments protect against it. Addiction is immensely complex and this is just a small piece of it. Research on learned helplessness is fascinating. Researchers would put dogs into shuttle boxes, long cage-like structures that the dog could move around in, and would shock the dog through the floor on one side of the box. The dog, at first, could easily escape the shock by moving to the other side of the box. Eventually, the researcher adds a wall so the dog can't escape the shocks. It just sits there, being shocked without escape. Through this, the dog learns helplessness over repeated trials and extended periods of time. Even when the wall is taken down, the dog won't walk to the other side and avoid the shocks anymore. It has become so used to the pain that it doesn't even try to escape when escape would be easy. This research has been used to explain certain aspects of human behavior, especially related to repeated experiences of abuse, addiction, and poverty. It takes a long time to get somebody out of this mindset, and is possibly one of the reasons why people get stuck in terrible situations. The car crash experiment. It demonstrated that the way investigators word a question has an immediate effect on the subject's memory of an event. It was part of a suite of studies by Elizabeth Loftus, with various other co-researchers, that began to call into question the veracity of eyewitness accounts. There have been some experiments conducted, but the negativity bias is really sad to me. Bias. It basically says that negative things have a greater emotional and psychological toll on our health than positive neutral things. So you got an A on a test. That's great. But you totally fail a test, and the world crumbles and it's a total disaster. 100 things can go right and work perfectly throughout the day, but it goes totally undetected in our minds. Then someone cuts us off in traffic and we fume and rage. I learned about this theory almost 3 years ago and think about it all the time. Reminds me to appreciate and notice the many little things in my day that do go right. I don't know the name of it, but apparently two people become closer if they survive through something together. Not even actual surviving death scenarios, but anything that has you on your toes and heart racing. Like a roller coaster. The influence of the color red in sports. Judges were shown a video of a taekwondo match and awarded more points to the red competitor versus the blue competitor. When the colors were digitally reversed, judges awarded more points to the other. Now red competitor. Edit. Since there's a lot more interest than I expected. Here's some more info. Red may be a signal of dominance as reddened skin is associated with higher testosterone, or possibly higher fertility in women. Wearing red may induce intrinsic psychological effects which increase dominance in addition to altering the perception of others. Researchers found that putting red leg bands on birds increased dominant behavior, as they took the lion's share of the food. For my psychology degree dissertation, I presented photos of men to be rated on a scale of friendly, 0, to threatening, 10. Men received a higher threat score if I photoshopped their t-shirt to be red. Edit 2. Thank you for the gold award. Aaron and Dutton, 1974, misattribution of arousal. Men who had just walked across bridge, either steady or unsteady, were approached by a female psychology student, posing to do a project on the effects of exposure to scenic attractions on creative expression. The men had to complete a questionnaire and write a short dramatic story about a picture she provided, and she gave them her phone number if they had more questions. Men who walked across the shaky bridge were more likely to call her up because they misattributed the arousal from the bridge to the woman. TLDR. Watch a horror movie on the first date. Edit. Grammar. Sorry about the confusion. If you stare into a dimly lit, that is, candlelit, mirror for 10 plus minutes, you start to see hallucinations. What individuals see tends to vary, but they've used this as a test to simulate schizophrenia before because some sea monsters' deformities general weird it. I did a variation of it for a mate at uni and completely wimped out of it. After my face started not looking like my face anymore, I had a complete dissociation. I stopped looking and just waited out the time. Edit. I can't find the exact study as I don't have journal access anymore, but here's a decent summary of it in layman's terms. Edit 2. This is a weird visual trick that your brain can play on you. but the effects can seem super real, so maybe don't do this if you are susceptible to hallucinations or a wimp with this kinda it like me. Edit 3. Thanks for the gold. And yes, it is basically a scientific Bloody Mary. Wegner and his white bears. Essentially, people who were instructed to not think about a white bear found themselves thinking about it more than those actively trying to think about one. Not a psychologist, but the one where given a choice between sitting down doing nothing and shocking oneself, people tend to choose the shock. Ergo, we would choose pain over boredom. It's not that psychopaths lack empathy, but rather, they have the manual settings. A specific region of the brain lights up when people experience empathy. For most people it's an automatic, subconscious response. But in a study where they showed emotional videos to psychopaths and none while scanning their brains, psychopaths would only light that region of the brain when specifically asked to feel for the character, while the control participants would light up automatically. The Rosenthal effect, the prejudice and expectations you have towards a student, contestant etc. highly dictates his performance in the long run. Look it up. Pygmalion effect. The phantom limb experiment is pretty fascinating. Basically, you can be tricked into feeling something that's not there. Here's an article about the experiment. Edit. Grammar. If people have the upper hand, they will put others down to keep it. An experiment told a class of kids that having blue eyes meant you were smarter, achieved more etc. All of a sudden kids with blue eyes formed their own groups. Things like bullying and exclusion of other eye colors started too. They repeated the experiment with different eye colors in different classes, all with the same results. Reconsolidation. When you retrieve a memory from your long-term memory, it is susceptible to being manipulated. This can lead to memories being totally changed from the source. This is why eyewitness accounts cannot be fully seen as true. This knowledge is also being used to help people with PTSD by changing the negative memories they have of their particular trauma. Dunning-Kruger Effect is one of my favorites. Basically, people with less expertise in a field will overestimate their abilities in the given field because they don't know enough to see the limits of their expertise. At the same time, experts tend to underestimate their abilities because they know too well what they don't know. The phenomenon has, among other factors, been linked to anti-vaxxers, who overestimate their expertise, not seeing what they don't know, with dire consequences. Whelp. The salmon study. To test a behavioral procedure in an MRI machine, the experimenters got a dead salmon to use as a dummy, as it had to be something organic. They were in shock when they discovered that the fMRI was recording increased bold response, blood oxygen level dependent, in the dead salmon when running their experiment, suggesting this dead salmon's brain was somehow reacting to the experiment. This led to the findings that fMRI is not perfect and we should expect a certain level of false positives, highlighting the importance of retests and tighter statistical analyses. Not entirely sure it fits into the category, but the Rosenhan experiment. 13 people feigned mental illnesses to get into mental hospitals and all were admitted with different diagnoses. They then assumed their normal personalities, but to be released they all had to admit that they were mentally ill. There was a second part where a hospital challenged Rosenhan to send multiple fake patients to the hospital and they would rate their patients on a scale of whether they think they were faking. They identified many possible fakers, but Rosenhan in fact hadn't sent anyone. The rule tends to be the less ethical the experiment is, the more interesting. The Little Albert experiment. A psychologist conditioned a baby into being scared of white, fluffy things. I also like this one very much. Scientists replicated 100 recent psychology experiments. More than half of them failed. There was an experiment to measure the dopamine, i.e. happiness, hit your brain takes when eating something you're craving. The dopamine builds with the anticipation and peaks right as you take the first bite. Then, after the first moment it's in your mouth, the dopamine levels begin to decrease. This showed that many times we are desiring, edited to show the distinction made by poster below, the attainment of the thing more than the thing itself. Edit, not to proselytize, but this corresponds somewhat to the Buddhist principle of unsatisfactory desire. It's very interesting. I loved learning about infant development. My favorite was probably the development of depth perception, or perhaps the fear of heights. We're not born with it, but if I recall correctly, we develop it within the first year or so. Scientists created a raised square platform. Half of the floor was wood and the other glass. The actual surface of the floor, 1 meter or so below, was white with red polka dots. At varying intervals of age, the babies would be brought in and placed on the wood end and encouraged to crawl to their moms, who were standing at the glass end of the platform. In early infancy, baby crawls over there without giving it. At some point though, they stop at the point where the wood meets the glass, or plexiglass maybe, showing that they recognize the difference in height and the fear of falling. Babies' brains are pretty ducking cool. Subjects were tested for introvert versus extrovert personality types. Prediction was that when placed in a sensory deprivation chamber, the introverts would be able to handle it easily while the extroverts would not. Exactly the reverse was found. Introverts became agitated quickly and performed all manners of self-stimulation. Extroverts quickly went to sleep. What the findings showed was that it's introverts who are the sensation seekers, needing stimulation from the outside world. Extroverts create their own internal sensation and project that out to the world. White rats and black rats were raised separately without seeing each other. When a black rat was placed in the white rat's cage, the other rats ostracized him. When white and black rats are raised together and a new black rat is placed in a cage, the white rats accept him. So basically, rats are racist, unless raised to accept differences. I'm a huge fan of Milgram's small world experiment. It is more sociology than psychology, but I still think it is really cool. Milgram sends out 160 letters containing the name and address of a stockbroker in Boston to people in Omaha, Nebraska. They had to send it to someone they thought would get the letter closer, but they couldn't mail it directly to the stockbroker. Interestingly, most people that sent on the letter sent it on to the same group of people on the 5th degree. It only took 6 people, hence the 6 degrees of separation, to arrive. On average, it shows how interconnected our world is, even before the internet, which is happy to think about. The 3 Christs of Ypsilanti. Psychologist forces 3 people who believe that they are Jesus Christ to live together. It does not go well. The psychologist, Milton Rokeach, had heard of a case where 2 women who believed that they were Mary, Mother of Christ, were forced to live together, and one of them broke free from their delusion. So he figured, 3 Christs, what would happen? They were angry at each other, often had physical fights. They eventually started getting along by avoiding the topic. He would ask them about the others and each would say that the others were crazy, that they, of course, were the real Jesus. No cures, some unethical stuff. Interesting though. Hubel and Wiesel inserted an electrode into the brain of a cat and took a single cell recording of a cell in its visual cortex. By somewhat of an accident, they found that the neuron only fired when an object had one specific orientation. This was pretty much the discovery of center surround on off visual processing cells in the V1 visual cortex. Cool stuff. Just the general psychological phenomenon of loss aversion. In cognitive psychology and decision theory, loss aversion refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. It is better to not lose $5 than to find $5. It's basically why insurance companies exist. I just recently heard of blindsightedness during one of my cognitive psychology classes. Basically, the area of the brain that processes what our eyes see is located at the back of the head, just where your skull starts to get smaller, towards your neck. Because of this, if you hit your head back there, quite often everything will go black for a moment before sight returns again. Sometimes though, following severe trauma to this area of the brain, like after falling off a ladder onto a curb or something, a person is never able to see again. For a long time it was assumed that the eyes were somehow incapable of seeing following the trauma, and that was why people were blind. However, it's been shown that it is just the processing of the images that is damaged. In other words, your eyes are still working away, viewing images, but your brain is unable to process the images, so you can't see them. Some experiments looking into this have found that people with damage to this area can still navigate around things in front of them without realizing they are doing it. So if you told someone with this damage to walk down a corridor and you placed obstacles in their way, they wouldn't be able to see the obstacles, but they could avoid bumping into them because their eyes are still able to view them and send signals to other areas of the brain to avoid knocking things. This is known as blindsightedness. Blew my little mind tbh. Edit. Here's the Wikipedia link about it. It's a little bit science tbh, but it explains a bit better what I was trying to say. Edit number 2. So I'm in the UK and it's currently 430 am. Just woke up to pee and I've been gilded. What the hell guys, IA thank you. Diet and behavior in children. TLDR. Sugar and sweets don't make kids hyper. I love this one because it's so counterintuitive and every parent loves to tell you how their kid definitely does. Researchers took a bunch of parents and their kids and split them into 2 groups, those who get healthy fruit and those who get sugary sweets. The kids were separated from their parents for a moment and given the fruit or the sweets. A few minutes later the parents were brought back in and either told the truth about what they'd been given or lied to and told the opposite. The parents and kids were left by themselves with an assortment of toys, and the parents were asked to rate their kids' behavior. What they found is that irrespective of what they were actually given to eat, parents who were told their kids had sugary sweets reported worse behavior than those who were told they had fruit. Again, irrespective of what they actually had, given fruit, given sweets, told the kids had fruit, kids behaved. Told the kids had sweets, kids misbehaved. Not told what they'd had, kids behaved. The interesting thing is that when you actually looked at the kids' behavior, they really were misbehaving, generally being more inclined to screech, throw toys around or ignore instructions. Turns out it's actually the parents' behavior that determines how the kids act. The same study has also been done with sugary drinks vs. water. Same result. The elevator groupthink study. Very amusing and sad at the same time. The experiment involved several actors entering an elevator with an oblivious participant. They then begin to perform a series of odd behaviors, such as they all stood facing the rear of the elevator. Inevitably, everyone else who got on ended up also facing the rear so as not to stand out from the rest. The study demonstrates how easily people succumb to group pressure to behave in a certain way. Not so much a psychology experiment, but a finding by retail researchers that if a woman is touched below the waist within the first 10 minutes of entering a store, she will leave immediately. That's why retailers who are onto this finding space their displays wide apart at the front of the store to minimize bumping. Then they pack the merchandise tight in the back, because shoppers who've made their way back there have already been in the store 10 minutes. Wish I had a link for this. It was cited in a magazine article a decade ago. Not just one experiment, but a whole thesis and series of work supporting it. According to the just world fallacy, we expect good or bad things to happen to people for a reason and go to pretty interesting lengths to make up for the lack of justice. Like someone winning the lottery and us thinking they deserve it. Not quite psychology, but it very cool. Normally, if you try to mix blue light with yellow light, red and green, it turns out as white light. A scientist conducted an experiment where they would shine blue light in one eye of someone and yellow light in the other. The majority said that they just saw the light separately, but some said that they saw a new color that they couldn't even describe. This also works with cyan and red, and magenta and green. The case study done of Jeannie. She was a severely neglected child that never learned to speak. It became apparent that it is not possible to learn a first language as an adolescent. Edit. OP. If you're in high school, you might enjoy taking AP Psychology. I'm late but nobody has said it yet. The self-fulfilling prophecy studies are very important to social psychology and their findings have many real-world applications. Basically they brought together a group of kids and formed a class with a real teacher. They gave the kids a test for overall academic skill at the start of the course, but didn't really use the scores. Instead they told the teachers that a few students, picked at random, were very brilliant and scores very highly. They then observed the class for a long period of time and noticed that the teachers gave the kids they thought were brilliant much more attention. At the end of the study the kids took the test again, and they found that the kids who were randomly named brilliant at the start actually scores higher than the rest of the class. The kids, again, at the start didn't score any different from the rest of the class. but through the self-fulfilling prophecy they became the best in their class. This obviously has tons of application in the world and especially education. Recent small sample size experiment in toddlers, 18 Mo, I think, investigating the link between fine plus gross motor skills and time spent on a computer tablet. Results showed no difference in gross motor skills between children who had spent lots of time on a tablet and children who had spent no time at all on one. Fine motor skills and understanding the task was largely increased in those who had spent time on tablets. There is an optical variable called TAU, expressed as image size divided by image expansion rate, and it has been shown to be used to perceive time to contact of an approaching object. Even diving birds have been shown to use it. The most interesting part is that the TAU quantity is perceived as a whole, directly, and not arrived at by any sort of implicit calculations. Also, its time derivative, called TAU dot, is used to control deceleration toward an object. For example, braking in a car. Physical activity, in the form of aerobic activity, does a better job of maintaining cognitive ability in aging than any brain training game or cognitively stimulating activities. Casual video games can reduce stress, like Candy Crush, Sushi Cat. Exposure to nature reduces stress and improves cognitive ability. The selective laziness of reasoning is an article I found and then partially replicated in my research methods class during my undergraduate. It's so great with a very interesting method and results that make you think about discussions and arguments a lot. Basically, the researchers presented participants with different syllogisms, logic puzzles like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is moral, etc., and they asked them to provide their answers and also their reasoning for the answers. Later on, the participants were asked to return and they presented some of their old answers, but the answers were reversed to be exactly what they had written down previously. But if their own argument from prior was presented as someone else's, they would disagree with it. The lesson: we critically evaluate other people's arguments with a lot more focused lens, and we afford ourselves less loopholes to jump through to validate, substantiate our own claims. The monster experiment. Although it is horrible how they left the children with mental health issues at the end, this experiment gave very good insight to how to parent a child. On this experiment, they took groups of orphan children and separated them into 3 groups. One was the control, the second were told they has a lips and were doing bad, and the third was told that their speech was perfect. As the experiment went on, Group 2 began developing lisps after being berated constantly. They became shy and reserved. They were scared to speak because they didn't want to get in trouble because of their poor speaking skills. Group 3, however, had the opposite happen. They talked better. They were more willing to improve. They were encouraged to keep speaking and told that their speech was amazing and perfect. By the end of the experiment, they had one group with no change, one group with now mentally ill children with a speech impediment, and one group with great speaking skills. It truly shows that encouraging children is the way to go and that verbal abuse can be just as, if not more, harmful as physical abuse. A lot of good material for that regard in thinking. Fast and slow. Our psych class repeated an experiment where half the class held a pencil in between their teeth, and the other half balanced on their top lips. We then rated how funny we thought a comic strip was. Turns out using face muscles associated with smiling, pencil between teeth, made the comic strip subjectively funnier than those associated with frowning, pencil balanced on top lips. Choosing to smile or frown can change how you feel and perceive life. The Bobo Dolls experiment revealed the impact of modeling violence on children's behaviors. The Monopoly Study by Paul Piff. He basically brought 2 strangers into the lab together and had them play a game of Monopoly together. He randomly assigned one participant to start the game with twice as much money than the other, and that participant also got to roll both dice to get around the board. That is, the other participant started with half the money and could only roll 1 dice. At the end of the game, when he asked the participants who started with more money why he won the game, they would chalk it up to their excellent strategy and gamesmanship rather than the fact that they had started the game with way more resources. It says a lot about how we deal with being born into a privileged state. Disappointed this isn't in the top comments. will probably get buried. Michael of Vsauce fame teamed up with a group of PhD candidates in the psychology department of McGill for his show Mindfield. They recruited 3 kids with different disorders: eczema with skin picking disorder, ADHD, and chronic migraines after a concussion. The kids were each told they were going to be the first to receive a new experimental treatment for their condition, which consisted of putting them into a fake, non-functional MRI machine. Before doing so, they told them that the machine had the power to help them heal their brain. Michael even got a bunch of famous YouTubers to make fake videos discussing the new technology to make the kids believe it. While they were in the machine, the researchers, dressed as doctors, asked the kids if they were feeling the effects of the machine, and that they believed it was working. They never lied to the kids. They just told them it would give them the power to heal themselves. All 3 of the kids had markedly improved symptoms several weeks later. The girl with eczema pretty much entirely stopped picking her skin to the point that she felt comfortable wearing short sleeve shirts for the first time. The mother of the kid with ADHD reported that he was much more calm and not as hyperactive. The kid with chronic migraines went from having something like 5-10 debilitating migraines per day to absolute 0. As shown by the chart his mom kept to track them. Placebos are a hell of a drug.